My name is Brian Morey from Frog Street, and today we're going to be talking about early numeracy acquisition for young children, particularly those in pre-K and kindergarten. And when I say pre-K, I'm including both 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and also children entering into kindergarten and in kindergarten. So I welcome you today, and again, any questions that you have, please feel free to ask in the Q&A, or please make note of my email address in case you wanted to, at other times, a question pops up after the webinar. You can feel free to shoot me an email, and with a question, I'll do that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, what we're going to talk about is from the Teaching Math to Young Children recommendation. This is from the What Works Clearinghouse agency that is going to be talking about best practices for teaching mathematics to young children. This practice guide is a very lengthy document, and today I'm going to go through just a little bit of information from that document. And down below the screen, you'll notice that I have a web address. If you are interested in downloading that particular document, you can do so because it's free of charge from the government. The What Works Clearinghouse is from the government. And you can look at the information that's from there. I'm going to be sharing in particular one document from this meta-analysis that's shared about teaching math to young children. And in particular, the practice guide talks about 5 recommendations for teaching math to young children. And I've listed here on the screen 5 of those recommendations. And today we're going to talk in particular about one of those recommendations, with a few references to recommendation number 3, which is talking about progress monitoring to ensure that what we know about teaching young children, knowing that what we're doing, the child is progressing towards various types of skills. And then also recommendation 4 and 5, which have to do with teaching children to view and describe the world mathematically, and dedicating time to teaching math and integrating math instruction through the day. Those recommendation 4 and 5 are more concerned with best practices that we do in our classroom, and recommendations 1 through 3 are mostly about what we know about how children learn math concepts. And today, again, our focus is going to be on recommendation 1, which is how children progress through a developmental sequence of continuum of skills that relate to number and acquisition and number sense. So again, this is based upon the latest research from that practice guide, which is a synthesis, a meta-analysis, or a meta-synthesis of all of the research that's been done on this topic. If you look at the screen and you were to ask a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 3-year-old, whomever, how many dots do you see? They're likely going to say, some of them might count, but a lot of them will just readily say 2. However, if you ask the child in this next screen how many dots, that's probably going to change. They're probably going to say a lot versus giving you a precise number. And today I want to talk about why it is that children move away from, when you're looking at small numbers, they can just instantly recognize and say something like 2 or 1. But when we move above numbers, particularly numbers above 3, that requires another skill, which is counting and having to understand and ask the question, how many? However, children, when they are trying to perform the operation of counting, can become confounded by just learning the skill to count. So in being able to answer that question, they might try and attempt to count, but their count can become complicated if they don't know how to organize and synchronize their pointing with their word recitation. So as they count, they might go out of sequence, say 1, 2, 4, 9, or they might not point to each object as they're saying a corresponding counting word. And that's what we're going to talk about today. But even as children gain these skills that are related to counting, if you were to ask those children how many dots, again, even 4-year-olds, if you look at this screen, you say how many dots, most adults are going to look at this and say there's about 20 to 30, and that's a good estimation. Younger children, however, will look at that screen and not give an approximation. They will say something like 100 or a zillion or whatever, but not with a proximity of a closer number that's a best estimation. That's because children at the age that we're talking about, preschool, kindergarten, particularly preschool, do not have what we call number sense, which is understanding, getting a sense or a feel of where numbers are in relation to each other and how they relate to each other. That said, even a first grader, however, who looks at that, could use counting and would probably be accurate in their counting after they've gained some skill in doing counting. However, they would have to rely on counting. And when you show this screen, which is by, just for your information, it's the same number of dots on the previous screen. When you look at this screen as an adult, you can say very quickly that there are 32 dots because you have a skill that we know as place value. You understand the number system in terms of tens and ones. So when you look at the arrangement of those dots and they've been arranged in 10 frame representations and the extra 2 dots, you immediately say 10, 20, 30, 32. However, even first graders who do not have that understanding of place value will likely, instead of using place value, will refer back to a less efficient skill, which is counting one by one. And so they'll have to count each of those dots individually. And so I show you these screens, these series of dots and representation of dots, just to emphasize how, again, our understanding of numbers and how we tell people how many, or how we describe numbers or represent numbers, falls through a continuum of skill progression and development. And that's what we're going to share with today. So when talking about, however, skill development and how children count, there's something that we need to take in consideration. It isn't just a matter of teaching them how to count. One of the things that research is coming up and finding, a lot of research is coming and being generated as of now, is seeing a link or a correlation between executive level functioning skills and something that requires an incredible amount of thinking and problem solving and deliberate intentional thinking, which is executive level functioning. And when I say executive level functioning, I'm talking about skills that are related to memory, how well children remember and retain information, also attention, their ability to focus. And in addition to focusing, memory, self-regulation, being able to put on hold their current interests, to put those on hold, or to delay gratification and focus on 2 things at once. That requires an enormous amount of effort. And so when children then, who are still developing this executive level functioning, which again includes memory, attention, and self-regulation, which again is oriented in the frontal lobe. That's where we know that executive level functioning occurs. As children are developing this skill, whenever they see something that is very perceptual, going back again to the instance of 2 dots, they can just quickly see something like that, just like they can describe color very quickly, which is a perceptual skill. Being able to say that something's red or blue doesn't take as much of what we would call memory load or cognitive load than, say, focusing on doing several tasks in order to understand a concept like counting. And so when you look at the number of dots in the other concentric circle outside of where I've labeled it conceptual versus perceptual, as children begin to operate on counting 1 to 1 that requires them to be able to focus. They can't just look at it and quickly say that's 6 or 7 objects. They have to actually start at one, move across in an organized way. And again, that organization, that effort that's required to quantify requires memory, attention, and focus. They have to be able to keep their eyes on each dot, be very intentional about pointing to each dot as they are saying a counting word. And so executive level functioning is just as important to this skill acquisition of counting as counting is per se. So that's something to be thinking about as we look and go into this. Now, in the next screen, we're going to see what is, let's see, there we go. In the next screen, we see what are the different skills that are related to being able to count, or be able to address the question of how many. And so this again comes to the issue of that saying how many is very different from saying what color is it. Because in order to figure out how many, you have to perform several operations simultaneously and be able to coordinate those in an organized manner with effort and intentionality before you can say or give that answer. And those I've listed here in this screen, the skills that are necessary for children to be able to intelligently answer the question, how many? So they have to have, through memory, an understanding or just know the number word list and its sequence, which means they have to know that you start with 1, you go to 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and so forth. You don't skip around. You don't start with 4 and say 7, 2, 9, and it isn't arbitrary. In addition to that skill, you have to be able to point to each object, which is referring to one-to-one correspondence. So as you're saying a number word, you have to synchronize it with your counting, which again requires focus. And then once you get to the very last item that you're counting, you have to know that that last word that you say tells you how many. So a lot of times when children are counting, they'll count a set of objects and they'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when they land on that last number 7, they don't really realize they've put so much effort towards counting or just coordinating their count that they don't realize the significance that 7 tells you, the last number you say tells you how many. And further, there's this idea of ordinality, which is different from cardinality. Cardinality deals with the quantity or the magnitude of the set. Ordinality has to do with the idea or the logic that it doesn't matter in what order you say something. The last number you say always it always will be the same amount regardless of how the objects are organized. So to say all of that with those different skills that we're looking at, what I have here in this next screen is again from that recommendation from the What Works Clearinghouse that talks about the developmental progressions that children go through in understanding number and operations. And there are 2 pages from that publication that I've scanned and put into the screen that I think are relevant to our conversation today, and and the 2 pages from that publication that I want to focus on, and so that you have a really good understanding of what those research-based progressions and continuums actually are. The very first one, table number 3, is on the right side of the screen, and table number 4 is on the left. Table number 3 is on the left side of the screen, and table number 4 is on the right side of the screen. Table number 3 lists the actual progressions, the different levels that children move through as they are attempting to quantify and tell how many. Table number 4 are the errors that can happen when children are counting. And I want to go through those errors because those errors will tell us in particular where children are falling down in terms of their skill development with counting. And once children have are no longer committing any of those errors, they're going to fall in this level 2 that's called meaningful object counting, which is the second row in table number 3. Now, if you go online and you download that long 163 document that I talked about from the What Works Clearinghouse, table number 3 is located on page 13 of that document, and table number 4 is located on page 19. And instead of just showing you these particular pages, I've created a PowerPoint that will further explicate what those stages and those errors actually are. I'm going to start with looking at what are various counting errors that children go through when they are counting. One of the errors that they commit a lot of times are just simple sequencing errors. Sequencing errors refer to saying the number sequence out of order. So as what you see here, you see a child pointing to each object, but the words that he's saying are not following the standardized sequence that has to be done. So they say 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 6, 2. And that's going to give them an inaccurate count, particularly if they land on 2 and say that's 2 altogether, simply because they don't know the number sequence that they're having to go through. The sequencing errors, however, can become even greater, more problematic as you move out of the single digits and you start working in the teens. Anyone who has learned to count using a Western-based language knows that the counting sequence and the way that we say counting words doesn't follow a logical pattern that maps onto the structure of the number system, like Eastern languages do. In Eastern languages, such as certain languages from, let's say, Africa, and even from Asia, such as Korea, when they say the counting sequence above 10, they have a much more logical sequence that's based on the base 10 structure of the number system. So when they say 11, they say 10-1 instead of saying a nonsensical word like 11. So they say 10-1, 10-2, 10-3, 10-4, 10-5, 10-6, 10-7, 10-8, 10-9. So they can tell that that follows a much more pattern sequence. And then when they get to 20, they don't say a decade. They say it again according to the base 10 structure of the number. They say 210. And then they go on and say 210-1, 210-2, 210-3. The same thing with 30, 310-3, 310-4, 310-5. So in other words, when children are counting in Eastern-based languages, it's more commonsensical than it is in Western languages. So a lot of children who are counting and have learned the English language and they say 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, those numbers don't make sense as 10-1, 10-2, 10-3, 10-4. And so that can become problematic for children who are counting again using the English language. Now, another error that children commit, in addition to sequencing, is coordination, and that has to do with when they point, they say more than one number word. So here you see a child on the screen, they're pointing, they're saying 1, 2, 3, and when they get to the fourth object, they double count. So they say 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And so once they've landed on the very last object, there's only 7 objects. They've said a total of 9 words, which is going to give them an inaccurate count. Another type of coordination error is one where they'll point to an object, they're pointing to objects, but they're not counting it. So in this scenario, you can see the child saying 1, 2, but for when he said 2, his finger moved and sort of skimmed both the second and third object. So he's double counting that particular object, and that's another type of counting error. So he'd label those types of counting errors, coordination errors. But in addition to coordination errors, we also notice that sometimes children have what we call keeping track errors. Keeping track errors refer to the child's ability to organize as they're counting. So here, what happens is, particularly when there's amounts above 5 or 6, the amount becomes so cumbersome that the child can't organize it in a coherent way. And they count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but then they go back and start recounting because they forgot they counted that one particular object. And so those are children who have difficulty keeping track. Now, interestingly, also there are children who will skim. Skimming is another type of notable error, which means they don't really point with intentionality. They just kind of hover over it and they say a word, but it doesn't really correspond to any particular counting. So when we say that children don't have one-to-one correspondence, one thing we want to be careful is really specifying what we mean. And I like these description of counting errors because they're more specific as to what type of one-to-one correspondence error is happening. Is it related to coordination? Is it related to keeping track? Or is it that they're not, or are they simply skimming? So it helps us to be more precise in our diagnostics about how children are counting in particular. And then another counting error is related to this idea of cardinality. Let's see if I can get my screen to advance here. So cardinality is, here you see a child. The teacher said, so how many was the child counts? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're accurate. They're pointing to each object in one-to-one correspondence. But when the teacher asks, how many was that? The child goes back over and recounts rather than saying the last word. So instead of saying 7, they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the teacher goes, yes, but I said, how many was that? And the child goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Not understanding again that the last object will tell you how many. So there are 5 different counting errors, what I've just reviewed. There's the idea of coordination errors, sequencing errors, keeping track errors, skimming errors, or where the child shows no evidence of cardinality. And that's important to see and understand these counting errors when we start thinking about the sequencing or the progressions that children go through when they're developing number sense, in particular counting. And the screen that I'm showing you right here gives you a preview, an overview of what those 6 levels are. And I'm going to, again, go through what each of those levels entail. And I'm going to provide some videotape footage that provides more specificity in relation to what those might look like when children are at those particular stages. Now, the 6 stages that I have there, I've labeled as some of them being very perceptual based skills, meaning that they don't require a lot of executive level functioning. Conceptual is coded in red, meaning it requires children to operate and really pay attention and requires a lot of effort to figure out how many. And abstraction is when children, when the learning has become, the conceptual learning that they've done has become automatized to the point where now they're able to abstract more complicated relationships. And in particular, they no longer are reliant on manipulatives or those type of visuals that might help to facilitate their conceptual development. So as we move through these 3 stages, we can think of them, these 6 stages, excuse me, we can think of them in terms of not only perceptual, conceptual, and abstract, but also keep in mind that as children move through these different, this continuum, that the amount of objects or the amount of objects that they're quantifying will also affect their ability level. So a child could be operating at a higher level with a smaller number. So in other words, a child might know that when you count 1, 2, 3, a child who's very skilled with numbers through 5 might know that the number after 4 is 5. However, when dealing with a quantity of 10, it's really extending it's requiring them to pay attention to more objects, and therefore they don't function at such a higher level. So understand that the process spirals as the numbers increase, as we're saying here in this particular slide. So let's look at what are those specifics levels that kids go through. One level that, again, is very perceptual in nature is this idea of small number recognition, which we call subitizing. But I want to clarify, when I'm saying subitizing here, subitizing also goes through a range of progression. And so I don't want to give when the researchers who look through all of the research that explains how children move through these progressions, in particular the research that's been done by Douglas Clements and Julie Samara in their Building Blocks research project, they have found that children, subitizing follows its own continuum of conceptual development, where children will first begin to subitize very small numbers, meaning they can recognize very small numbers, but then the amount of numbers that they can quickly recognize without counting grows with their age. So children who are 4 typically can recognize a quantity of 4 without having to count. Children who are 5 can then move to 5. But here what we're talking about are children who just are so familiar with numbers, particularly to 3, that they don't really rely on counting. And counting, they don't really, it's a very perceptual skill. They can just see 3 dots, and they might count 1, 2, 3, but since there's so few objects to count, it doesn't require that much of a skill of one-to-one correspondence anyway. So once children are at this level that they can recognize small quantities and know that, yes, there's 3 objects here, we're able to start looking at another skill. Now, here's a child, Tomika, who's mastered level 1. She can recognize small quantities to 3, but she's not at a level 2. She's learning, she's struggling and moving into level 2 because she doesn't have the skill development. And here Tomika is learning to coordinate her counts, and you can see that she's committing several counting errors that we talked about before in the past screen. So let's watch this video. So what we see here with Tomika is Tomika knows the counting sequence, but what she has difficult doing is coordinating it with her pointing. So we know that she's not what we call here in the next screen, we call this meaningful object counting. The child who is now learning to count greater quantities above 3 has to use counting as a strategy to figure out how many. And that requires, like I said before, a lot of attention, a lot of focus, memory, intentionality to coordinate your counting so that when you say 1, it's synchronized with the pointing. So we'll see this in the screen. But something else is also going on in meaningful object counting. When children count, they need to understand that each object that they count is cumulative. And so every time they count, they're including the number before it. So let's look and see what happens on the screen. So carefully when we count, we say 1, then we go to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when we land on 7, we know that that 7 refers to all of the objects that we counted, not just the one that we landed on. Because sometimes when children count, and let's say they get to the 6th object there and they say 6, and you say, give me 6, they'll just give you the 6th object that they counted on. So that is, once children have developed and mastered all of those counting to the point where they no longer commit the errors that we talked about earlier, we can say that they're meaningful object counters. But again, they're meaningful object counters up to a particular number. So a child might be a meaningful object counter to 10, but when you start presenting numbers above 10, like say to 20, they start breaking down and they commit errors. And so they're not a meaningful object counter to 20, but they're a meaningful object counter to 10 because that's the amount that they're comfortable with. So here's Tyquashia, excuse me. Tyquashia is very comfortable with numbers to 5. And so because she's comfortable with numbers to 5, she's ready for instruction that looks at understanding that 5 isn't just about counting it, but that regardless of how you arrange it, it's still 5. And she makes this discovery because she has that skill under her belt of counting. So once children become meaningful object counters, they can start focusing in on the quantity. And we're going to see that related to the next level, which is level 3, which we'll see in the next slide. But here's Tyquashia and how she is functioning at this particular level that's just above the meaningful object counter. Let me try that again. There we go. So there we see Tyquashia has learned that now that she's so comfortable with counting, she can focus in on understanding 5 as a quantity. And that's essentially what happens when we start moving into stage 3, which is understanding that, that the last number that you say tells you how many. And here, counting becomes so automatized for children that they're able to use counting as a way to solve problems. So, for instance, when you show children, let's say a set of 7 blue and 6 red objects like you see here in the PowerPoint screen, a lot of children might be confounded and say, okay, just because they're perceptual, that there's more red because it's spread out. But a child who's functional at level 3 can use their skill of counting to confirm and help them judge whether or not if their perception is true or not. And so what happens is that as they count, they can count and then know and solve a problem by using counting-based comparisons. And it's even at this level then that children begin to understand that the meaning of using numerals to label quantities, or they're even able to, when you say, would you give me a set of 8, rather than just having 8 objects on the table and they count it, you say, give me 8, or they're looking at a bucket of crayons and there's several crayons in there, and you say, would you give me 8? They can count out 8 and stop at 8 rather than continue on. So these children are operating at a much higher level of understanding. I'm going to look here. I think I've got some people who are wanting some questions. Or, okay, no, not yet. I was thinking I had some questions in here. Anyway, so let's go on and look at a child who is at that next level of counting. This is Ophelia, who, again, she is able to solve problems with counting. She can answer a question of, let's say you have 3 and 2 more show up. So here's a child, again, who can use counting to solve problems, which is typical of a level 3 student. So here for Ophelia, what you see is, instead of struggling with counting, like we saw with Tomika, the very first video, she didn't have to worry about counting. She could focus on solving a problem with counting, which would place her at a level 3 with objects to 5. So again, now, however, she might not be able to solve problems with quantities or sums to 10. So that might mean that she's a meaningful object counter to 10, but she is a level 3, which is a counting-based comparison with numbers to 5. So that's something, again, to consider as you're assessing children and looking where they're at. Now, this next progression is beginning to start getting into more abstract, where children know immediately the number after without having to recount. When you add another object, let's say that here in this screen, I'm going to put, if you look at the blue shade, that right there, there's 6, in the yellow shade, there's 6 blocks that have been there, and the child knows that there's 6. But when the teacher puts one more, the green one, the child, instead of going back and counting at 1, she just knows, oh, there were 6, now there's 7. So they know the number after. And this next screen will show that very easily. Again, interesting, what I want you to know is that all of these children who are in these videos are in preschool. So what you'll notice is that the skill isn't particular to a particular age level, that children can be functioning on different levels depending upon their experience and as well as their executive level functioning. This is Franco, who demonstrates number after knowledge. So again, Franco's he knows, when he asks him, how do you know? He says, well, because 6 comes after 5. That's a very good demonstration of what number after knowledge would be. Now, when we start moving into level 5, we're talking about now more of a mental comparison of close numbers, which is not having any reliance on objects, and they can more visualize by having a number line in their head per se, where when you show them 2 numerals, 9 and 7, and they compare them, they know that 9 is greater just by looking at the numeral. Children who are able to do this have a very strong understanding of the number line, and they have been exposed to number lines. And I highly recommend that even in preschool, that children work around number lines and do several activities or games with number lines. That can be a powerful way for them to internalize that knowledge. And eventually, when we get to level 6, this is where the number and understanding number relationships becomes very abstract, where they really know that with automaticity the number before and the number after. So when you say, well, you know, I have 6, but, or for example, I have a nephew called Noah who he has also a friend named Noah who lives next door to him, and Noah is 5 years old, and Noah, my nephew, is 6 years old. And when I asked Noah about how old his friend would be when he's 7, Noah immediately said, well, he would be 6. And I said, well, when your friend's 8, how old will you be? And he said 9. So that meant that without having to count, Noah knew the number before and the number after. Now that's a very typical, we don't typically see children at that level at pre-K. That's a very much more abstract, and we start seeing that coming along in kindergarten and developing in kindergarten. So here's an example of Rachel, who again is solving a problem. She no longer is relying on manipulatives, and she can do things in her head. She makes a mistake, but she self-corrects because again, she can do and contain all of these numbers in her head, which is what we call mental mathematics. So you can see here, Rachel, I mean, even though she made this mistake, it's absolutely amazing that she can keep all this information straight in her mind and remember this aspect, remember this other quantity. And you can see how this really shows how the executive level functioning really does intersect with the skill ability. It requires not just, so in other words, when we teach children to count, it's very important that they have the memory, the focus, the attention, along with the other skills that they're operating with. And by the way, this is something I'm going to say that's a little bit off topic, but it's related to executive level functioning. The purpose of preschool is really to develop that executive level functioning where children can develop memory, intentionality, and focus. And the best venue for helping that develop, according to various learning theorists such as Vygotsky, is through play. Children learn to be intentional through their play, and that's one of the reasons why in early childhood education, play is such a critical venue for instruction. So again, that's an aside, not necessarily related to what we're talking about, but it's important nonetheless. Now, when we differentiate for children, and I have here an example of an activity where children are rolling a number cube or a dot cube, and then they're having to fill a frame with a certain amount of counters. And for different, I could differentiate that for each of the children that we talked about. For Tomika, rather than use a very small number cube, they're now selling these very large dot cubes that when Tomika rolls that one for her, she could put the bears on top of each dot and then put them into the boat to help her correspond and maintain one-to-one correspondence. Tyquashia, on the other hand, Tyquashia, excuse me, doesn't need that extra scaffolding. She can rely on the ability to just look at that smaller number cube and not rely on having to put objects one-to-one. And she can just count the dots and then put a corresponding amount into the 10 frame. However, Franco, I can eliminate the dot cube altogether and just have numerals. And since Franco knows the number line so well, he can just look at a numeral and put a corresponding number. So when we talk about differentiation, we're not talking about necessarily taking children having to do an activity, but rather we could make a separate activity for different children, but rather we can just adapt them in activities that we do. And to do that, we need to be able to do progress monitoring, which means observing children and looking to see how they respond. And after we observe them, plan activities, and then again go back through that cycle of assessing, observe, and record. And to do that, we can do that not necessarily by interviewing children. You can also do that in the authentic context of them playing games or being involved in centers, like we see the children here in this slide. They're playing with manipulatives, counters, in a manipulative center, and I could just simply ask the little girl there, how many do you have altogether in this particular bin? And so that could be something that children could look at. Now here, this is an example of progress monitoring in action of a teacher who's actually who's asking the child how many objects he's counted. And you'll see here he commits various types of counting errors, and we'll go back and review that. Wait, excuse me, I went back. So this is David. So what we see here with David is that what I would say, if I was to give through my progress monitoring and using the information we've discussed so far, I would say that David he knows 5. So I know that he's a meaningful object counter to 5 because he maintains one-to-one correspondence with numbers to 5. But once the numbers are above 5, like with 7, he starts getting burdened and overburdened, and he doesn't know how to organize his count. So I can say he's a meaningful object counter to 5, but he's still working on developing that same fluency with numbers to 10. So rather than give David, having him work with 15 counters, I'm just going to keep it down small between 5 and 10 to keep it in a range that he's comfortable with. So there are activities for progress monitoring that one of the things that I'm going to do is I made a few activities in games. Particularly games can be in an inviting context for having kids do different activities. I'm going to upload and send to Region 9 various activities that I've made throughout the years that engage children in authentic context rather than testing them individually, but just allowing them to, like you can see the 1 to 9 tile configuration cards, they use tiles to fill different outlines, and then you ask them how many tiles did it take you to fill that particular outline. So those are authentic activities that provide an opportunity to do progress monitoring. Also, you can inject numeracy throughout the day, such as taking attendance, figuring out how many children are at school. Children can practice counting, rote counting as they go across to see how many children are present that day at school. In addition to that, children can also be engaged in lessons. And this is an example I have here, a book that is very powerful for teaching the concept of cardinality, which again relates to the issue of one-to-one correspondence. I have a question here. I'm going to field it right with. I have a question from Jennifer Breslin. Can you talk a little about language development and these math skills? For example, can a child still learn math concepts if there's a language delay? I understand that similar structures are used in the brain, but wondering if math concepts can develop along a different track. Yes, absolutely. Math skills and language skills can, that's a very good question. Math skills do follow along a different trajectory. Again, they require some of the same prerequisites in terms of executive level functioning. But with language skills, I mean, children, for example, if I have a child who is nonverbal and I'm saying, would you tell me how many? A lot of those children, for example, will use their fingers. They might not say the word, but they have this understanding of quantity without actually having to say anything by using their fingers or drawing a picture. So if you show, if the child sees that there's 5 objects and they use their fingers to show that there's 5, I'll know, well, that child must be a meaningful object counter because he can quickly quantify without having to actually use the verbal skills to do so. So yes, I mean, obviously the language does enhance it. Language enhances and makes our learning, it helps us, language helps us to remember things, but we don't have to be, there are ways to help children who are nonverbal still progress along other skills, and that's a very good question. So here, if I'm teaching an idea of counting and cardinality, the Anno's counting book is a very good book. In this book, one of the things I want to show you is I have a screen that shows what is in the book, and here you can see it's a very different type of counting book. Here we have, rather than there being a picture of just three things, you see 3 of many different things. So when I read this book to children, I show them the representation of 3 cubes on the right, on the left-hand side of the screen, and I count 1, 2, 3. And then I go across the page and we count how many boats, 1, 2, 3. How many trees, 1, 2, 3. And what the child begins to figure out is that they're always landing on 3, and that 3 represents a quantity rather than just a name in a sequence of numbers. And you can see here on the next screen, there's other quantities. And so as they go up, the number builds. And they learned that the representation of that quantity, 4, can be represented in many different ways. So this is a very powerful book to use. Again, there are other places in your classroom as well where math happens authentically. Interestingly enough, we have math centers, but math center isn't always a place where math happens. As a matter of fact, when children are using blocks, when they're using manipulatives and other different centers, we can observe them doing and ask them, how many blocks did you use to do this? And those have higher levels of interest for children. And so numeration happens in many different places rather than just the math center. Also providing various materials that encourage children to do quantification, like number cubes, dice, numeral stickers, dry erase boards, even things like pattern blocks that show part to whole relationships. Like, in order to make a hexagon, you need 6 triangles to make a hexagon. That open-ended materials are very good for developing quantification strategies. Also, there are ways to integrate, in talking about language and numeracy and literacy, we can integrate. Here is when I was teaching, I had the McDonald's Center where the children had to fill French fry orders, and so I cut apart sponges, yellow sponges, to make something that looked like a French fry, and got French fry boxes from McDonald's. And they would go to a menu that you see over there where it says McDonald's, and they would choose a number order. And the person at the cash register would record that you want 7 French fries, and they would fill those French fries using the number 7. And I had a number line there that was a French fry filler that allowed them to, if they didn't know how to count, they had a number line there to help them remember to start at 1 and move to the number where to move to the number on the number line where that represents the number that was on their order ticket. And again, that can happen through play. Also, games are a very good format for anything where they're moving things along a number line. They're using a number cube and generating a set that's representative of a particular quantity. Again, those are very powerful strategies and formats for teaching. So you have a variety of venues teaching through routines, number lessons, centers, play, all sorts of ways are helping so that you can get a read of where children are at on that continuum and integrating it in a way that's meaningful to them. So here, I'm going to stop the slide, and this is where again, this PowerPoint will be available online for anyone that wants more information. And I also will send Region 9 some of those files and activities that you can download and implement if you want.